It's not a place, Mrs. Sedgwick. Coronation Street's more than bricks and mortar to me, or I thought it was.
This is the story of what really happened to Bill Waddington, the man who spent 14 years playing Coronation Street's Percy Sugden, once his life on the cobbles came to an end. It is not a story about why he left the program, but about everything that followed, from a new life on a Yorkshire farm to the illness that slowly weakened one of television's most famously irritating characters. Before Percy Sugden entered the picture, Bill Waddington had already lived most of a career that stretched across several different eras of British entertainment. His life had started a long way from Weatherfield. Percy came much later. Born William Joseph Waddington on the 10th of June 1916 in Oldham, Lancashire, Bill grew up as the fourth child of parents who ran the Clarence Hotel in the town. The family had lost twins the previous year, and with Bill's father away fighting during much of the First World War, Bill and his sister spent part of their childhood being raised by family friends, while their mother kept the household going. His early years were anything but polished. Several school moves followed changes of address, and at 10, he managed to get himself thrown out of the church choir after stealing 2 bananas from a harvest festival display. Grammar school ended at 14, with Bill later remembering himself simply as the clown of the class. That instinct for comedy stayed with him. Before entertainment became a career, Bill worked ordinary jobs in a butcher's shop, sold goods door to door, and later sold cars. But the idea of performing never really disappeared.
Just what I've been looking for.
Good, I think you made a very wise choice, Mrs. Goodlip. There's nothing like Coronation Street if you like a bit of life.
The Second World War finally gave that ambition somewhere to go. Serving as an army cook, Bill's comic ability caught the attention of people around him, and that led to a place in a forces entertainment troupe called the Blue Pencils. Armed with a ukulele and heavily influenced by his hero George Formby, he entertained troops with jokes and songs while also writing much of his own material. BBC radio broadcasts brought him a wider audience, and before long, he was being billed as the Army's top comic. War had unexpectedly opened the door to the profession he had always wanted. Once civilian life resumed, Bill turned that wartime experience into a full-time career. Stand-up comedy and character acting took him through the music hall and variety circuits for decades, and by 1955, he had climbed all the way to the top of the bill at the Royal Variety Performance. It was a long way from selling cars. During those years, Bill also opened shows for major visiting American stars, including Frankie Lane, Lena Horne, Billy Daniels, and Dorothy Lamour. Representation came from Lou Grade, one of the most powerful agents in British entertainment, and the work kept coming.
What are you suggesting, Mrs. Pierce?
I thought it'd appeal to you.
Appeal to me? Good God, woman, you think I am a pervert?
Through the 1970s, Bill built a stage partnership with Carry On star Sid James, which lasted until James died suddenly in 1976. 3 years later, Bill appeared in a small role in Victoria Wood's first television play, Talent, made for Granada. Coronation Street had already crossed Bill's path by then, although nobody watching would have attached much importance to it. Between 1967 and 1980, he turned up in 4 separate minor roles, each completely unrelated to the others. One appearance involved a man with a pipe in a cafe, another a drunken businessman, another a theatrical manager called Eric Summers, and another a wedding best man named George Turner. None of those characters lasted. What nobody could have guessed in 1980 was that Bill would soon return to the program as someone impossible to forget. By the early 1980s, Bill had reached 67 and had already retired. Life had also dealt him a heavy personal blow because his second wife, actress and singer Lillian Day, died from cancer in 1980 after more than 30 years of marriage. And if you remember classic EastEnders too, I've launched a sister channel called EastEnd Spotlight, exploring the exits, feuds, secrets, and overlooked stories behind Walford's biggest legends. A quick subscription there can really help us grow this community of classic British television fans too. The link is pinned in the comments below. Bill was living alone when Coronation Street came calling again. That changed in 1983. The writers had created a pompous, argumentative former army cook who would work as a caretaker, and the part had been written specifically for Bill Waddington. There was no audition process. Percy Sugden simply belonged to him. 14 years followed, and they transformed a retired variety comedian into one of the most recognizable older faces on British television. Percy arrived in August 1983 as caretaker of the local community centre, carrying himself with all the confidence of a man convinced that military discipline could solve almost anything.
Well, that's it. I'm off.
What have I just told you lot?
There's no consideration for anybody these days.
When retirement forced him out of that position, he found another uniformed role as a school crossing patrol man, bringing the same obsessive sense of order to the job. Percy never stopped talking about his army days. His favorite claim summed him up perfectly. If you had managed to make gravy under shell fire, Percy believed you could manage just about anything. Eventually, Percy moved into Emily Bishop's home as a lodger, and that arrangement lasted for the best part of a decade. This is where the character really settled into his most familiar form, interfering, opinionated, and completely convinced that everyone around him would benefit from his advice. Percy could be exhausting. That was exactly the point. Viewers loved being annoyed by him. One tabloid poll reportedly placed Percy Sugden as the third most hated person on television, behind J.R. Ewing from Dallas and Alexis Carrington from Dynasty. Bill apparently loved the result. To him, irritation meant attention. More importantly, it meant audiences cared enough to react. Coronation Street also reunited Bill with people from a much older chapter of his career. Jill Summers, who played Percy's endlessly devoted admirer Phyllis Pearce, had shared variety bills with him years earlier. Betty Driver and Tom Menard came from that same world of post-war entertainment.
If you think for 1 minute I'm going to be sat down all day with a bit of charcoal in my hand, gossiping with a load of arty geriatrics, you're very much mistaken.
The result was almost like a reunion of an entire generation of performers. Percy and Phyllis became one of the show's great comic pairings of the period. She pursued him relentlessly. He avoided her whenever he could, and somehow the pair always ended up together again. Their rhythm came from performers who understood exactly how to play off one another. Years of stage experience showed. Bill's popularity eventually reached a level that looks almost extraordinary now. By the time he left Coronation Street, 5 separate Percy Sugden Appreciation Societies reportedly existed around the country, including one at Cambridge University. For a character built around being difficult, that was quite an achievement. October 1986 brought another major moment when Bill became the subject of This Is Your Life. Eamon Andrews and bandleader Joe Loss surprised him at London's Euston Station as he stepped off a train from Manchester, with Bill completely unaware of what awaited him. 3 years later, he joined the Coronation Street cast at another Royal Variety performance. Music even came back into the story. Bill had released a solo Christmas single in 1986, but it failed to chart, and that might easily have been the end of that particular experiment. Instead, in 1995, the Coronation Street cast recorded Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, and the record reached number 35 on the UK singles chart. Bill Waddington had somehow become part of a charting record in his late 70s. Books followed too. His autobiography, The Importance of Being Percy, appeared in 1992, and Percy's War came 2 years later, timed around the 50th anniversary of D-Day. After decades spent working the variety circuit, Bill finally had the kind of national recognition that had always remained slightly beyond his reach. This was the high point of a very long career. Fame had arrived late, but it had arrived properly. That changed as Coronation Street itself began moving in a different direction. Brian Park took over as executive producer in 1997 and began reshaping the program. Long-running characters disappeared, new families arrived, and the tone became rougher. The Battersbys were among the most obvious signs of that change, moving into the street as noisy new neighbors during the summer. Bill, now in his 80s, had grown closely associated with an older style of Coronation Street. The newer direction did not appeal to him. Contemporary reports described him as objecting to what he saw as a lack of morals, while other accounts claimed he felt the program had become too raunchy. And that is when Bill decided to go. The writers apparently wanted to kill Percy off, but Bill resisted that idea. He preferred a quieter departure, leaving open the possibility that Percy simply continued living somewhere away from Weatherfield. The program eventually gave him exactly that. Within the storyline, Percy became increasingly fed up with his noisy new neighbors, and also wrongly convinced himself that Emily Bishop had begun secretly drinking. The solution was Mayfield Court, a retirement home where Phyllis Pierce was already living. Percy chose to move there, and his final episode aired on the 20th of October, 1997. There is an important distinction here. Mayfield Court belonged entirely to Coronation Street. Bill Waddington did not leave the program and immediately move into a retirement home bearing that name. His actual retirement looked very different, and that real-life final chapter is where his story becomes much more personal. Once Coronation Street ended, Bill largely stepped away from full-time acting. His last known television credit was reportedly an advertisement for the Little Chef restaurant chain, which gave his career an oddly understated ending. This was the same performer who had once topped the bill at the Royal Variety Performance. Away from television, something far more unexpected had already happened. 2 years before leaving Coronation Street, Bill married for a fourth time. The year was 1995, Bill was 79, and his new wife was Sheila Torr, who was reportedly around 20 years younger than him. Sheila came from a family deeply rooted in British entertainment. Her brothers included Barry and Paul Elliott, better known as the Chuckle Brothers, as well as Jimmy and Brian Elliott, known as the Patton Brothers. Marriage suddenly made Bill Waddington brother-in-law to one of the best-known comedy families in British children's television. It was an unusual connection, but the marriage proved important during the years that followed. Together, Bill and Sheila built a life far removed from Weatherfield. They settled in a 17th-century farmhouse on the Pennine Moors near Micklebring, close to Sheffield and Rotherham in South Yorkshire. Retirement did not mean sitting quietly indoors. Reports described Bill keeping more than 2,000 pigs and turkeys at different points, along with several racehorses. Farming itself was not entirely new to him. Years earlier, during the more successful period of his comedy career, Bill had already bought land and attempted to rear pigs while driving a Rolls-Royce. That particular venture reportedly failed, although he later enjoyed better fortune-breeding racehorses at a stud he owned in Shropshire. Now, late in life, the countryside called him back. Animals, farmland, and horses replaced scripts, studios, and television schedules. For a man who had spent decades performing for audiences, the pace must have been completely different. The cobbles were behind him. For a while, this appears to have been one of the happier periods of Bill's later life. He had remarried in his late 70s, settled into rural surroundings, and stepped away from a program that had dominated 14 years of his life. The schedule had gone. A different kind of routine took its place. Then illness began to change everything. Bill had been living with Parkinson's disease for some time, and as the condition progressed, his physical strength declined. Frailty gradually made life at the farmhouse harder. Eventually, staying there was no longer possible. A nursing home in Maltby, South Yorkshire, became Bill's final residence. It was close to where he and Sheila had been living, which meant she could remain a regular presence in his life. According to surviving accounts, Sheila visited him every day. That detail matters. The illness took away more and more of Bill's independence, but it did not leave him alone. On the morning of the 9th of September 2000, Bill Waddington died at Rotherham General Hospital. He was 84 years old. His career in entertainment had lasted close to half a century, beginning with wartime performances for troops and stretching through music hall, stand-up, television, and 14 years as Percy Sugden. Bill was buried at St. Peter's Churchyard near Minchell Vernon in Cheshire, not far from Crewe. It brought to an end a life that had moved through several completely different versions of British entertainment. There is something quietly sad about the contrast. Percy Sugden projected endless confidence, bossiness, and certainty, forever telling people how things ought to be done, usually while reminding them about his military experience. Bill's final months looked nothing like that. The man behind Percy had become frail through Parkinson's disease and spent those months in a nursing home, relying more heavily on others, while Sheila continued visiting every day. For someone whose most famous character seemed determined never to need anybody, the difference is striking. Percy's old boast about making gravy under shell fire belonged to another world by then. Bill Waddington's life had become much quieter. Percy Sugden never completely disappeared from Coronation Street itself. Years after Bill left, the character's name continued to surface in conversation, suggesting that Weatherfield had never entirely forgotten its most interfering pensioner. In 2019, Kevin Webster referred to Percy while discussing old-fashioned names, remembering that there had once been a Percy living nearby who was, in Kevin's words, as miserable as sin. 2 years later, Rita mentioned him as well. Those brief references kept the character alive inside the program long after Bill himself had died. What Coronation Street has never directly explained is what eventually happened to Percy after Mayfield Court. The character simply moved there in 1997 and faded away. No later storyline confirmed his death, and no later storyline confirmed that he was still alive. Percy remained unresolved. Bill's own connection to Coronation Street continued through his family. His daughter, Barbara Waddington, also became an actress, and, like her father, appeared in more than one role across the long history of the program. It created a small link between the Waddington family and Coronation Street that lasted beyond Bill's own years as Percy. Looking across Bill Waddington's life, the contrast between his rise and his final years is hard to miss. Decades of variety work eventually led to the Royal Variety performance, followed years later by unexpected television stardom at 67, a This Is Your Life, surprise at Euston Station, 5 fan societies, 2 books, and even a charting single. Recognition came late. When it arrived in force. Percy Sugden became the sort of character people loved because he annoyed them so much. Bill turned irritation into affection, and audiences rewarded him for it for 14 years. His final chapter moved in the opposite direction. Marriage brought Sheila into his life when Bill was already 79, and together they settled on a farm surrounded by animals and horses. The move offered a quieter life, one completely removed from Weatherfield. Parkinson's disease eventually narrowed that world again. The farmhouse gave way to a nursing home in Maltby. Strength gave way to frailty. Through it all, Sheila kept on visiting. That is the real story of Bill Waddington's tragic final years after Coronation Street. Percy Sugden may have gone off to the fictional Mayfield Court in October 1997, but Bill's real life continued for another 3 years, first with the happiness of rural retirement and then with the hardship brought by Parkinson's disease. His ending was not dramatic in the way television endings usually are. There was no final speech, no return to the cobbles, and no grand farewell. There was a farm, an illness, and a wife who stayed close. Bill Waddington died in September 2000 at the age of 84, leaving behind a career that began with wartime entertainment and ended with one of Coronation Street's most memorable older characters. Percy Sugden simply faded from Weatherfield. Bill Waddington's real final years were much quieter, much harder, and far more human.